Elisabeth's blood was a jagged scarlet inkblot against the permafrost when Caelan Thorne delivered the final, sickening blow. The white stags belong to those with the steel to take them, herbalist, he spat, his voice echoing through the frozen grove. The solitary guardian lay motionless on the edge of the ironwood, her consciousness already drifting toward the white sleep, her ribs crushed and spirit fracturing. Caelan, Jaren, Bram, and Silas stood over her crumpled form like dark monoliths, their heavy cloaks snapping in the sub-zero midnight wind. "Is she gone?" Jaren's voice was a frantic whisper. Caelan watched the agonizingly shallow rise of her chest and grinned. "Not yet. But the winter is a patient killer. Let the frost finish our work." The four brothers turned toward the village, their rhythmic boot crunches fading into the oppressive silence of the pines. They left her to the ice, certain that no one had seen their cruelty. Elisabeth's fingers twitched inches from the snow, but she was too broken to crawl. The temperature was plummeting. In less than an hour, the white sleep would claim her heart. But Caelan Thorne had made one fatal mistake. He thought the woods were empty. Between the ancient, snow-heavy trees, 20 pairs of glowing yellow eyes had witnessed every strike. The shadows were moving, and the ironwood was coming to claim its own. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Let's continue with the story. The silence that followed the Thorne brothers' departure was heavier than the falling snow. It pressed down on Elisabeth, a physical weight that stifled the ragged, wet sound of her breathing. Every gasp sent a shard of crystalline air into her lungs, blooming like ice fire against her shattered ribs. The white sleep was no longer a village cautionary tale used to keep children away from the winter woods. It was a living tide, rising from the permafrost to claim her marrow. She tried to push upward, her fingers clawing at the frozen earth, but her right arm was a dead weight, a useless limb of lead and agony. The cabin sat only 300 yards away, a dark silhouette against the silver-washed pines, but in her state, it might as well have been on the far side of the moon. Her vision blurred, the edges of the world fraying into a hazy, dreamlike gray. The bloated moon, usually her guide through the labyrinthine groves of the ironwood, now felt cold and judgmental, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced in time with her flickering consciousness. This was the brutal irony of the forest she had spent her life protecting. Elisabeth had spent years tending to the wounds of the wild, binding the broken wings of owls and drawing iron snares from the legs of foxes. Now, the ironwood seemed to be waiting for her to join the soil. She felt the peculiar, deceptive warmth that heralds the end, the lethal siren song of hypothermia that tricks the brain into feeling as though it is bathing in sunlight while the heart begins to stutter. Her thoughts drifted to the white stags. She wondered if they were safe, or if Caelan's steel had already found them. A low, rhythmic crunching sound broke through the hum of the freezing wind. It wasn't the heavy, arrogant stomp of Caelan Thorne's boots. This was something lighter, more synchronized, the sound of many feet moving with a singular, predatory purpose. Elisabeth forced her eyes open, her lashes heavy with frost. Shadows detached themselves from the base of the ancient pines. At first, they were merely darker patches of night, but then the moon caught the silver of their fur and the amber fire in their eyes. They did not growl. They did not snap. They moved with a terrifying, reverent grace, circling the clearing until the snow was mapped with a complex web of pawprints. In the center of the circle, Elisabeth lay like a broken offering. She expected the flash of teeth, the final mercy of the predator. Instead, she felt the air change. The biting wind was suddenly blocked by a wall of thick, musk-scented fur. A massive shape, larger than any wolf she had ever seen, stepped into her narrowing line of sight. It was Fenris. The alpha stood over her, his breath a warm, huffing cloud in the freezing air, his yellow eyes holding a depth of recognition that transcended the wild. As the white sleep tried to pull her under for the final time, the heat of the pack began to seep into her frozen skin, a living barrier of fur and muscle against the encroaching frost. The massive beast lowered its head, the silver-gray fur of its ruff shimmering like liquid steel under the lunar glare. Elisabeth stared into those molten amber eyes, and for a heartbeat, she saw the end of her story. She expected the snap of jaws, the sharp, final puncture of the throat, a cleaner death, perhaps, than the slow, agonizing crystallization of her blood in the permafrost. She closed her eyes, her breath hitching in a sob that she didn't have the strength to release. But the bite never came. Instead, she felt the rough, sandpaper texture of a tongue against her forehead, licking away the frozen droplets of blood and salt. Recognition sparked through the freezing fog of her mind, a memory of iron and pain. This was the same beast she had found 3 winters ago, its leg mangled by a jagged hunter's snare in the deep brush. She remembered the way it had snarled then, a sound of pure, primal terror, and the way it had eventually gone still as she used her oil and steel to pry the teeth of the trap apart. She had fed it dried meat and whispered old songs until it could limp back into the shadows. She had named him Fenris, a ghost of the woods, and tonight, the ghost had returned to claim a debt. Fenris let out a low, guttural chuff, a command that rippled through the surrounding shadows. The 19 other wolves, who had been circling like spirits of the storm, began to close the gap. They didn't move with the frantic energy of a hunt, they moved with the solemnity of a ritual. One by one, they lowered their massive bodies into the snow, pressing their flanks against Elisabeth's broken frame. The heat was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was a living, pulsing furnace of musk and wood smoke scent. Fenris himself settled directly behind her, his massive chest acting as a windbreak against the sub-zero gusts that howled off the frozen peaks. He rested his heavy chin over her shoulder, his warmth blooming through her tunic like a miracle. The white sleep began to recede, chased back by the collective heartbeat of 20 predators who had chosen, for this one night, to be a fortress. Elisabeth felt the vibration of their breathing, a rhythmic hum that seemed to synchronize with her own faltering pulse. The terrifying cold of the Minnesota-style winter still bit at the air above them, but within the huddle, she was encased in a sanctuary of fur and tooth. As she drifted into a different kind of sleep, not the white one of death, but the deep one of survival, she felt the low, mournful vibration of the pack begin to echo through the valley. It was a warning to the world. The forest had claimed its guardian, and it would not let her go. The temperature continued to plummet, turning the air into a shimmering veil of ice crystals that hung suspended in the moonlight. Within the huddle of silver fur, Elisabeth was a small, fragile spark in a sea of predatory heat, but the white sleep was a persistent thief. It didn't just attack the skin, it reached into the mind, whispering that it was okay to let go, that the pain in her ribs was merely a dream, and that the silence of the snow was a soft, velvet bed. Her eyelids, heavy with the weight of near death, began to slide shut once more. Then, the vibration started. It began deep within Fenris's massive chest, a subsonic thrum that Elisabeth felt in her own bones before she heard it with her ears. It wasn't a howl, not yet. It was a low, mournful resonance, a primordial frequency that seemed to rise from the very roots of the ironwood. One by one, the other 19 wolves joined in. The sound grew, a collective drone that vibrated through the frozen ground and into Elisabeth's spine. It was a physical tether, a cord of sound meant to bind her soul to her body when the spirit wanted to drift into the ether. The call of the ironwood echoed out of the clearing, spilling over the ridgelines and into the valley below like a slow-moving river of sound. It was a song of the wild spirit, ancient and demanding. It spoke of the first frost, the blood on the snow, and the survival of the pack. To anyone in the distant village who might have heard it, it would have sounded like the wind mourning, but to Elisabeth it was a lifeline. Each pulse of the sound acted like a hammer against the door of her consciousness, refusing to let her slip into the final darkness. She felt her heart, which had been slowing to a sluggish, icy beat, respond to the rhythm. The wolves weren't just guarding her body, they were singing to her blood, commanding it to keep moving. The vibration was a bridge between the animal and the human, a recognition that the woman who had saved the alpha was now part of the forest's own pulse. Whenever her breathing faltered, the pack's resonance grew louder, more insistent, a wall of sound that the white sleep could not penetrate. Through the haze, Elisabeth realized she was no longer just an herbalist from the edge of the woods. She was being woven into the legend of the ironwood itself. The pain was still there, sharp and jagged, but it was anchored by the steady, vibrating heat of 20 protectors. She remained suspended in that space between life and death, held fast by a choir of predators who refused to let their guardian become a ghost. The moon reached its zenith, a silver witness to the pact, as the valley hummed with a power that the Thorn brothers, in their small, cruel hearts, could never hope to understand. The warmth of the village tavern felt malignant, a suffocating heat that did little to thaw the ice hardening in Jaron Thorn's chest. While the hearth crackled and the smell of roasted malt filled the air, the four brothers sat in a shadowed corner, their heavy wool cloaks still damp with melted snow. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves, but beneath the gale, a stranger sound drifted from the ironwood, a low rhythmic vibration that made the ale tremble in their cups. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible, a funeral dirge sung by the throat of the wild. "She's dead by now," Bram whispered, his fingers twitching against the scarred wood of the table. "The frost would have taken her heart before we even reached the village gates." "It doesn't matter if she's dead," Kalen snapped, his voice a low, jagged blade. He leaned forward, the firelight catching the cruel lines of his face. "The morning patrol rides at dawn. If they find the herbalist lying on the main trail with her skull cracked and her ribs stove in, they won't blame the winter. They'll look at us. They'll look at the blood on your boots, Jaren." Jaren looked down, his face paling to the color of ash. "We should have just left her alone. She was just a girl, Kalen. She was just protecting the stags." Kalen's hand shot out, gripping his brother's wrist with bruising strength. "She was an obstacle. But dead or alive, she is now a witness we cannot afford to leave on the doorstep of the village. The ironwood is deep, and its ravines are bottomless. If we move her now, under the cover of this moon, she simply disappears. The white sleep takes many wanderers. It won't be a murder, it will be a tragedy." Silas, the youngest and quietest, looked toward the window. The silver moon was a bloated eye, watching. "The wolves," he murmured. "Did you hear that sound? It wasn't a hunt. It was something else." "Wolves are scavengers," Kalen sneered, standing up and throwing a heavy coin on the table. "They've probably already started tearing at her. All the better. There will be less of her for the patrol to find." He gestured toward the door, where their wooden cart sat huddled against the stone wall of the stable, its wheels rimmed with frost. "Fetch the cart. We go back, we load the remains, and we bury the evidence so deep in the black pines that even the crows won't find it." The brothers rose, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the tavern floor. They moved with the frantic energy of men trying to outrun their own ghosts. As they stepped back out into the sub-zero night, the air felt like a physical blow, a reminder of the mercy they had denied Elisabeth. They didn't know that the vibration they had heard wasn't a song of mourning, but a call to arms. They hauled the cart toward the tree line, for men against the darkness, convinced that the forest was a silent accomplice to their crime. They were wrong. The ironwood was not silent, it was waiting. The wooden wheels of the cart groaned against the rutted frozen earth, a jagged sound that tore through the preternatural stillness of the ironwood. Kalen led the way, a heavy wood axe slung over his shoulder, his eyes narrowed against the silver glare of the moon. Behind him, Jaren and Bram struggled with the cart, its axles screaming in the sub-zero air, while Silas trailed behind, his hand trembling on the hilt of a rusted hunting knife. They reached the edge of the sacred grove, the place where they had left the herbalist to the mercy of the white sleep, expecting to find a quiet, snow-covered corpse or the scattered remains of a scavenger's feast. Instead, they found a fortress. The clearing was no longer a scene of abandonment, it was a cathedral of silver and shadow. At first, the brothers saw only the eyes, a constellation of glowing amber and molten gold that seemed to hang in the air like low-burning embers. Then, the moon shifted, and the nightmare took shape. A living wall of fur and muscle stood between the brothers and their victim. 20 wolves, massive and motionless as statues carved from winter itself, formed a perfect protective phalange around Elisabeth. "What in the hells?" Bram's voice broke, a frantic whisper that died in the freezing wind. In the center of the ring, Elisabeth was barely visible, cocooned in a thick, pulsing layer of silver-gray fur. Fenris, the alpha, stood like a titan at her head. He didn't growl, he didn't need to. The sheer weight of his presence was an indictment. His fur was frosted with rime, his massive paws planted firmly in the snow, a silent declaration that the girl belonged to the wood. The wolves were not feeding, they were standing sentry, their collective heat visible as a low, shimmering mist rising from the pack. Kalen stepped forward, his knuckles white around the handle of his axe. He was used to the forest fearing him, used to the wild retreating before the bite of his steel. But as he looked into the eyes of the alpha, he felt a primal chill that no hearth could ever warm. This wasn't a random encounter with a hungry pack. This was the ironwood answering his cruelty. The wolves stood shoulder to shoulder, their flanks touching, creating an impenetrable barrier of tooth and spirit. "Get back, you curs!" Kaelan snarled, though his voice lacked its usual venom. He swung the axe in a wide, desperate arc, the steel whistling through the air. The pack didn't flinch. Not a single wolf retreated. Instead, the circle began to tighten, a slow, methodical contraction of silver and shadow. The Thorn brothers, who had come to hide a body, suddenly realized they were the ones standing in an open grave. The cart, intended for Elisabeth, now looked like a pitiful cage for their own cowardice as the forest leaned in to collect its due. The silence of the ironwood was broken not by a howl, but by the sharp, metallic ring of Kaelan's woodaxe as he shifted his weight. His pride, a bloated and festering thing, could not endure the humiliation of being held at bay by beasts. To Kaelan, the forest was a resource to be harvested, not a power to be feared. With a guttural roar that was more panic than courage, he lunged forward, the heavy steel blade whistling through the air toward the skull of the nearest wolf. The strike never found its mark. With a fluidity that defied the freezing air, the pack moved as a single, sentient shadow. The wolf Kaelan targeted vanished into the darkness with a deceptive sidestep, and before the axe could even bite into the snow, the coordination of the ironwood was unleashed. There was no chaotic snapping or mindless biting. Instead, the wolves moved with a terrifying, tactical precision. Two massive males lunged from the periphery, not to kill, but to disable. Their weight slammed into Kaelan's chest, the impact sounding like a hammer hitting a drum, sending the axe flying into a snowdrift. As Jaren and Bram moved to help their brother, the remaining wolves surged forward, forming a secondary ring that cut the brothers off from one another. Silas fell to his knees as a wolf larger than himself stood over him, its hot breath melting the frost on his collar, its teeth mere inches from his throat. The Thorn brothers, who had stood as a wall of cruelty against Elisabeth, were now islands of terror in a sea of silver fur. Every time Kaelan tried to rise, Fenris would let out a low, vibrating growl that seemed to rattle the man's very teeth, pinning him back into the freezing slush with a single look. They were trapped in a living cage. The wolves didn't tear them apart, they held them in a state of suspended agony, forcing them to witness the sanctity of the grove they had desecrated. The brothers' breath came in ragged, terrified gasps, their bravado stripped away until they were nothing more than frightened children lost in the dark. The pack's amber eyes never wavered, a collective gaze that judged and found them wanting. Then, through the rhythmic thrum of the wolves' vibration, another sound emerged, the steady, rhythmic tap of a staff against frozen wood. A warm, flickering light began to dance through the trunks of the black pines. The elder had arrived, guided by the mournful call that had echoed into the village. As the old man stepped into the clearing, his lantern illuminating the surreal tableau of 20 wolves guarding an unconscious girl and pinning 4 killers to the earth, the true power of the ironwood was finally revealed. The wolves did not move for the elder, they parted just enough to let him pass, recognizing a different kind of authority. The trial of the Thorn brothers had begun, presided over by the ancient spirits of the wood and the cold, unyielding light of the full moon. The elder did not waste words on the 4 men trembling in the snow. With a sharp gesture of his oaken staff, he commanded the Thorn brothers to seize the handles of their own cart. In a stroke of poetic justice, the vessel they had brought to vanish a corpse became the litter that would carry a survivor. Under the watchful, unblinking gaze of Fenris and his pack, who shadowed the cart like silver ghosts just beyond the torchlight, the brothers were forced to haul Elisabeth back to the village. They moved with a frantic, stumbling haste, spurred on by the low growls that vibrated through the freezing air whenever they dared to slow. Once inside the healer's sanctuary, the atmosphere shifted from the predatory chill of the woods to a suffocating, herbal steam. The elder worked with a frantic, calculated precision, knowing that the white sleep was a thief that didn't leave easily. He did not move Elisabeth toward the roaring hearth immediately. To do so would have caused her frozen heart to shatter under the shock of the heat. Instead, he stripped away her ice-crusted tunics and wrapped her in skins warmed by nothing more than the ambient breath of the room. "The frost is in her marrow," the elder whispered, his gnarled hands steady as he began the ancient ritual of the thaw. He used snow water infused with yarrow and wintergreen to vigorously rub her limbs, a counterintuitive technique designed to wake the blood without scalding the nerves. The air in the hut grew thick with the scent of boiled willow bark and the heavy, humid heat of a life being dragged back from the threshold. The gamble lay in the tincture. The elder leaned over her, tilting a vial of dark, viscous liquid against her blue-tinged lips. It was a decoction of ironwood heart, a rare moss that only grew on the oldest pines, known for its ability to ignite an internal fire. "Drink, child of the wood," he murmured. "The pack is still waiting at the gate. They will not hunt until they hear your heart beat true." Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant, rhythmic scratching of claws against the village's wooden palisade. Then, a shudder racked Elisabeth's frame. It was a violent, gasping breath, the sound of a soul slamming back into its vessel. Her eyes flew open, the pupils blown wide and reflecting the amber glow of the lanterns. She did not see the elder or the thatched roof, she saw the molten gold of Fenris's gaze. Her hand twitched, her fingers searching for the warmth of fur that was no longer there, as the first agonizing bloom of real warmth finally broke the ice within her. She was alive, but the girl who had been beaten in the snow was gone, replaced by something tempered in the frost and guarded by the wild. The trial was not held in a hall of stone, but in the center of the village square, beneath the same silver moon that had witnessed the blood on the snow. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Kaelin, Jeren, Bram, and Silas stood bound with coarse hemp rope, their faces haggard and grey, stripped of the arrogance that had fueled their cruelty. They looked not like men, but like ghosts already half-claimed by the dark. Beyond the village palisade, the low, rhythmic vibration of the pack continued, a steady, predatory hum that served as a constant reminder that the forest was still listening. Elisabeth emerged from the healer's hut like a spectre of winter itself. She was pale, her skin the color of parched bone, and she leaned heavily on a staff of rowan wood, but her eyes held a clarity that burned brighter than any torch. As she moved toward the center of the assembly, the villagers fell into a reverent, terrified silence. She did not look at the brothers with hatred, she looked at them with the cold, detached gaze of the ironwood. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the soft whisper of a girl, but a low resonance that seemed to echo the vibration of the wolves. She spoke of the crunch of the frozen earth, the weight of Kaelin's boot, and the way the white sleep had tasted like sugar and iron as it tried to swallow her whole. She told of the 20 pairs of eyes that had watched the betrayal and the heat of the fur that had kept her heart from shattering. With every word, the Thorn brothers seemed to shrink, their crimes laid bare not just before the village elders, but before the very spirits of the land. "The ironwood does not seek vengeance in the way of men," the elder announced, his voice heavy with the weight of ancient law. "It seeks balance. You sought to exploit its secrets and discard its guardian like refuse. Therefore, the forest shall be your judge." The sentence was not the gallows or the sword, but something far more absolute. The brothers were stripped of their cloaks and their steel, left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They were led to the village gates, which groaned open to reveal the obsidian depths of the pines. "You are exiled," the elder proclaimed. "Walk the very trails you desecrated. If the forest finds you worthy, you shall survive the night. If not, the white sleep will finally finish the work you started." Kaelin tried to speak, to beg, but the words died in his throat as a massive silver shadow detached itself from the tree line. Fenris stood at the edge of the torchlight, his amber eyes locked onto Kaelin with a terrifying, patient recognition. One by one, the brothers were forced into the darkness. As the gates slammed shut behind them, the vibration of the pack reached a fever pitch, then suddenly went silent. The hunt had begun, and for the Thorn brothers, the ironwood was no longer a resource to be plundered, but a living, breathing conscience that they could never outrun. The ironwood had exhaled the winter's cruelty, trading the jagged white of the white sleep for a verdant, pulsing canopy of emerald and gold. The scent of damp earth and blooming hemlock now filled the air where blood and frost had once reigned. High above, the protected white stags moved like pale ghosts through the thickets, no longer hunted by the greed of men, but honored as the heart of a kingdom reborn. This was the dawn of the Ironwood Pact, a sovereign sanctuary where the boundary between the village and the wild had been stitched together with a thread of mutual survival. Elisabeth moved through the dappled sunlight of the grove with a stride that was no longer tentative. The scars on her ribs still ached when the rain moved in, a reminder of the night she had nearly become part of the permafrost, but her spirit had been forged into something unyielding. She no longer lived in bitter exile on the fringe of the community. Instead, she walked the forest as its voice, the bridge between the hearth fires of the village and the ancient, silent laws of the pines. The villagers, once fearful and distant, now brought her offerings of grain and cloth, seeking her counsel on the movements of the seasons and the secrets of the soil. At her side, a shadow detached itself from the ancient roots of a great oak. Fenris did not approach as a pet, but as an equal. The massive Alpha was a sentinel of silver and iron, his presence a silent testament to the night the pack had chosen a guardian over a feast. Together, they walked the trails that had once been stained with her blood. Where Kaelin Thorne's boots had once stomped with destructive intent, there was now only the soft, rhythmic cadence of paws and leather. The Thorne brothers were gone, lost to the memories of a winter that did not forgive. Their names were now a cautionary whisper used to teach children that the forest has eyes, and those eyes do not blink. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, amber fingers across the sanctuary, 19 other shapes flickered between the trees. They were always there, a living wall of fur and tooth that moved in perfect synchronization with their leader and his human kin. Elisabeth paused in a clearing, placing a hand upon the silver ruff of the Alpha's neck. She felt the low, familiar vibration in his chest, the same resonance that had kept her heart beating when the world had gone cold. The Ironwood was no longer a place of fear or exploitation. It was a cathedral of the wild, guarded by a woman who had returned from the dead and 20 wolves who had refused to let her go. In the deepening twilight, the herbalist and the beast stood as one, the sovereign rulers of a land where the pact was written in blood, honored in spirit, and protected by the unwavering gaze of the forest itself. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more werewolf romance tales, alpha kings, rejected mates, and powerful omega stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this story and what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next. Your support means everything and helps me create more content like this. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next.